The complaints were vague. Families saying something felt off during evening visits, but nothing they could prove. So the nursing home owner decided to check himself in as a patient for 2 weeks, posing as a new resident with early dementia. On his third night, he noticed the 80-year-old volunteer slipping into rooms long after lights out. Richard Moss had owned Meadowbrook Care Centre for 11 years. His grandfather built the place in 1962, back when nursing homes were called rest homes and families still felt guilty about sending their elderly there. Richard grew up in these hallways, playing in the common rooms, eating lunch in the kitchen while the staff worked their shifts. He knew every corner of this building. He thought he knew what happened here. But in the past 3 months, something had changed. It started with small comments. A daughter mentioned her mother seemed more anxious during evening visits. A son noticed his father had stopped talking about the staff the way he used to, with warmth, with familiarity. A wife said her husband flinched when she arrived unannounced one night. Not much, just a slight pulling back, like he was bracing for something. Richard reviewed the incident reports. Nothing. He checked the staff schedules. Everyone was showing up on time, clocking out when they were supposed to. He looked at the medication logs, the meal records, the activity sheets. Everything was in order. Everything looked fine on paper. But the comments kept coming. And then, in late September, a family pulled their mother out of Meadowbrook with no explanation. Just a terse email saying they'd found a different facility. Richard called them. The daughter wouldn't give details. She just said, "I don't think she was being cared for the way she should have been, especially at night." At night. Richard started staying later. He'd walk the halls at 8 p.m., 9 p.m., checking in with the evening staff. Everyone was professional, friendly. The residents seemed comfortable. But he wasn't there at midnight. He wasn't there at 2 in the morning. He wasn't there during the hours when most families weren't allowed to visit, when the building was dark and quiet, and the staff worked with minimal oversight. So he made a decision that most people would call extreme. He would go undercover. He worked with his attorney to set it up carefully. Legal liability, consent forms. He told only 3 people, his lawyer, his director of nursing, and the admissions coordinator who would process his fake paperwork. Everyone else would believe he was a new resident named Robert Miller, 71 years old, early-stage dementia, no family, transferred from a facility 2 states away that had closed due to financial problems. He grew out his beard for 2 weeks, let his hair go uncombed, bought clothes from a thrift store, the kind of worn, generic pieces that elderly men wear when they've stopped caring about appearance. He practiced moving slowly, practiced forgetting words mid-sentence, practiced the vacant look he'd seen in residents who were starting to lose themselves. On a Tuesday evening in early October, Richard checked himself into his own nursing home. The admissions process was smooth, professional. The coordinator, who knew who he really was, kept her face neutral as she walked him through the paperwork. She assigned him to room 14, a semi-private room on the west wing. His roommate was a man named Eugene, 83, who slept most of the day and didn't speak much when he was awake. Perfect. Richard sat on the bed, the thin mattress hard beneath him, and looked around the room. He'd seen this room 1,000 times, but he'd never stayed in it. Never felt what it was like to be on this side of care. The evening staff introduced themselves. A nurse named Brenda, mid-40s, efficient but not unkind. An aide named Marcus, younger, with a quick smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Another aide named Jennifer, who barely made eye contact. They checked his vitals, showed him where the call button was, explained the dinner schedule. Dinner was at 5:30. Richard shuffled to the dining room with the other residents, moving slowly like he'd practiced, and sat at a table with 3 others who didn't acknowledge him. The food was lukewarm. Not bad, but not good either. Institutional. The staff moved through the room quickly, dropping off trays, clearing plates, not stopping to talk. By 7 p.m., the residents were back in their rooms. By 8 p.m., the lights were dimmed. By 9 p.m., the building was quiet. Richard lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Eugene snored softly across the room. Footsteps passed in the hallway every so often. Quiet voices, the sound of a cart rolling past. Normal sounds, nothing alarming. He waited. At 10:15, he heard the night shift staff arrive. New voices, different energy. He listened to them talk in the hallway just outside his door. "Who's on rounds tonight?" "You and Jessica. I'll cover the West Wing." "Any problem residents?" "The usual. Mrs. Patterson will call for water. Mr. Chen will try to get up. Just keep an eye on them." The voices faded. Richard stayed still, his eyes closed, breathing the way someone asleep would breathe. After a while, an aide came in, shined a flashlight briefly across the room, and left. Standard bed check. Nothing unusual. The second night was the same, quiet, professional, staff making their rounds every 2 hours. Richard started to wonder if he'd been wrong. If the complaints were just the normal anxieties families feel when they hand over care to strangers. But on the third night, something changed. Richard woke to the sound of his door opening. He kept his eyes closed, stayed still. It was just after midnight, too early for the scheduled bed check. Someone entered the room, footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. Not the heavy, efficient stride of the night staff. These steps were slower, uneven. Richard opened his eyes just slightly, enough to see through his lashes. An old woman stood at Eugene's bedside. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, her back curved with age. She wore slippers and a cardigan over her nightgown, her white hair thin and uncombed. She held something in her hands, a small bag. Richard couldn't see her face from this angle, but he could see her hands. They were shaking slightly as she reached into the bag and pulled out what looked like a tube of lotion. She squeezed some into her palm and began rubbing it gently onto Eugene's hands. Eugene didn't wake. The old woman worked slowly, carefully, massaging the lotion into his dry, cracked skin. She did both hands, then put the tube back in her bag. She stood there for a moment, just looking at him. Then she pulled his blanket up higher, tucking it around his shoulders. She turned to leave and paused when she saw Richard. Their eyes met. Richard kept his expression blank, confused, the way someone with dementia might look if they woke up disoriented. The woman didn't seem alarmed. She just smiled slightly, brought a finger to her lips in a shh gesture, and left the room. Richard lay there for a long time after she was gone, his mind racing. Who was she? Why was she in their room? Why was she putting lotion on Eugene's hands at midnight? Before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. The next morning, Richard asked about her, carefully, using his confused, uncertain voice. "There was a lady," he said to Brenda during breakfast, "in our room last night." Brenda looked up from her medication cart. "A lady? What did she look like?" "Old, white hair. She was putting something on Eugene's hands." Brenda frowned. "That must have been Mrs. Calloway. Eleanor, she's a volunteer. She used to be a resident here, actually. Her husband passed a few years ago, but she stayed on to help out. She does that sometimes, checks on people at night." "Is she supposed to?" Brenda shrugged. "I mean, she's not staff, but she's harmless. She just likes to help. The residents seem to like her." Richard nodded slowly, playing his part. But inside, his mind was working. A former resident, now a volunteer, going into rooms at night without supervision. That wasn't protocol, that wasn't safe. Even if her intentions were good, it was a liability issue. He needed to know more. He spent the next 2 days observing. During the day, Eleanor Calloway was easy to spot. She sat in the common room most mornings doing jigsaw puzzles or reading large print books. She ate lunch with the other residents, moved slowly with her walker, seemed like any other elderly woman living out her final years in a place that smelled like disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. But at night, she transformed. Richard started staying awake, watching. Just after midnight, Eleanor would leave her room and begin making rounds. She moved quietly, stopping at specific doors. Not every room, just certain ones. She'd slip inside, stay for 5 or 10 minutes, then move to the next. Richard waited until she entered the room across from his, then carefully got out of bed and positioned himself where he could see through the partially open door. Eleanor was sitting beside an elderly man named Walter, who Richard knew had advanced Parkinson's. Walter was awake but couldn't speak clearly anymore, his words garbled and frustrated. Eleanor held his hand and spoke to him softly. "I know," she said. "I know it's hard, but you're not alone. I'm here." She pulled a small carton of juice from her bag, the good kind, not the generic brand the facility served, and helped him drink it through a straw. She wiped his mouth gently with a cloth napkin, not the scratchy paper towels the staff used. She stayed with him until he fell back asleep, her hand resting on his. Then she moved to the next room. Richard followed at a distance, staying in the shadows. Eleanor went to Mrs. Patterson's room next. Mrs. Patterson was 92, mostly deaf, and often forgotten during the evening shift because she couldn't call out for help. Eleanor brought her a small container of the hand cream she'd used on Eugene, plus a hairbrush. She brushed Mrs. Patterson's hair slowly, carefully, the way you'd brush a child's hair. Mrs. Patterson's eyes were closed, but she was smiling. In the next room, Eleanor brought socks to Mr. Chen, whose feet were always cold because his circulation was failing. Thick, warm socks, not hospital socks, good ones, room after room, small things, a glass of water placed within reach, a pillow adjusted, a nightlight plugged in, a blanket that actually provided warmth, things that should have been done by the staff but weren't. And then Richard saw something that made his chest tighten. Eleanor entered room 23, where a woman named Dorothy lived. Dorothy had late-stage Alzheimer's and was mostly nonverbal. She'd been at Meadowbrook for 4 years. Richard knew her family rarely visited. He knew she spent most of her time alone, sitting in her chair, staring at nothing. Eleanor sat down next to her and pulled out a small photo album from her bag. "Let me show you something," Eleanor said, even though Dorothy couldn't respond. She opened the album and began pointing at pictures. "This is my Henry. That's the day we got married. Look how young we were. 53 years we were together, 53 years. She turned the page. "This was our house. See the garden? I loved that garden. Henry built me a little bench so I could sit while I worked. He was good like that. Always thinking of what I needed." She kept talking, showing pictures, telling stories. Dorothy didn't react, but Eleanor didn't seem to need her to. She just kept talking, her voice soft and steady, filling the silence that surrounded Dorothy every single day. After 20 minutes, Eleanor closed the album, kissed Dorothy gently on the forehead and said, "I'll see you Thursday, I promise." Richard stepped back into his room before Eleanor could see him. He sat on the edge of his bed, his hands shaking. This woman was doing the work his staff should have been doing. She was providing the care, the attention, the basic human dignity that people pay for when they come to a place like this. and she was doing it alone, in the middle of the night, using her own money to buy juice and lotion and socks and God knows what else. Why? The next morning, Richard approached Eleanor in the common room. He sat down across from her at the puzzle table, moving slowly like Robert Miller would move. "You helped my roommate," he said, "the other night, with the lotion." Eleanor looked up, her eyes sharp despite her age. "Did I wake you? I try to be quiet." "No, I saw you, and I wanted to say thank you." Eleanor smiled. "Eugene's hands get so dry. The staff doesn't always have time to help with things like that. So I do it." "Why?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She set down the puzzle piece she was holding and looked at him carefully. "Why do you think?" "I don't know. It's just you do it at night, when no one's watching." "That's when it matters most," Eleanor said quietly. "During the day, there are visitors, there are activities, there are people around. But at night, that's when people feel most alone. That's when they need someone." Richard chose his words carefully. "You used to live here, as a resident?" Eleanor's expression changed. Something painful flickered across her face. "Yes, for a little while, after my husband died." "What happened?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He died here, in room 31, 4 years ago. I was with him at the end, but I wasn't here the night before. I went home to sleep. The staff said they'd call me if anything changed, but when I came back the next morning, the night, nurse told me Henry had been awake for hours, calling out, confused, scared. And no one came. They were too busy, or too tired, or they just didn't hear him." Her hands tightened on the puzzle piece. "He died thinking he was alone, and I wasn't there to tell him he wasn't." Richard felt something break inside his chest. "I'm sorry." "It wasn't personal," Eleanor continued. "The staff here aren't cruel, they're just overwhelmed. There aren't enough of them. There's too much to do. So things get missed. People get missed. And I couldn't let that keep happening. Not to anyone else. So you stayed." "So I stayed. I moved out of the residential wing and into the assisted living side. Told them I wanted to volunteer. They didn't question it. Why would they? Free help is free help." "And you've been doing this for 4 years?" "Every night?" Eleanor nodded. "Tuesday and Thursday nights mostly. Sometimes more if I hear someone struggling. I can't be here every night. I'm 80 years old. I get tired. But I do what I can." Richard swallowed hard. "The things you bring, the juice, the socks, the lotion, where do you get them?" "I buy them. With my pension. It's not much, but I don't need much anymore." "Eleanor, I know what you're thinking," she interrupted. "That I shouldn't have to do this. That the staff should be doing it. And you're right. But until someone fixes the problem, I'm going to keep doing it. Because I made a promise to Henry. No one else is going to die here feeling alone. Not if I can help it." Richard didn't know what to say. He sat there, playing the role of a confused elderly man, while inside he was screaming. This was his facility, his responsibility. And he'd been so focused on budgets and staffing ratios and regulatory compliance that he'd missed what was actually happening. His residents weren't being abused, not in the obvious ways, but they were being neglected in 1,000 small ways that didn't show up on reports. They were being left alone when they needed presence. They were being overlooked when they needed attention. They were being treated like problems to manage instead of people who deserved care. And an 80-year-old woman with a pension and a broken heart was the only one filling the gaps. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He stayed awake and watched Eleanor make her rounds again. This time, he paid attention to different things. He watched the night staff. watched how they moved through their duties with mechanical efficiency, how they checked boxes and completed tasks but didn't actually see the people they were serving, how they talked to each other but not to the residents, how they were doing everything they were required to do and nothing more. It wasn't malicious, it was exhaustion, it was understaffing, it was a system that measured success by how many medications were distributed correctly and how many incident reports were filed, not by how many people felt cared for. At 3 in the morning, Richard heard something that confirmed everything. He was pretending to sleep when 2 night aides walked past his room, talking in low voices. "Did you check on Mrs. Patterson?" "She's fine. She never needs anything." "She rang her call button earlier." "Yeah, I know, probably wanted water. But I was dealing with Mr. Chen. By the time I finished, she'd stopped ringing. So she must have figured it out. Or gave up." They laughed. Not cruel laughter, just tired, indifferent laughter, the kind that comes from people who've stopped seeing residents as individuals and started seeing them as tasks on a list. Richard got out of bed and walked to Mrs. Patterson's room. She was awake, lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Her call button was still in her hand, but she wasn't pressing it anymore. "Mrs. Patterson?" Richard said softly. She turned her head. She couldn't hear him well, but she saw him. He pointed to the water pitcher on her bedside table. It was empty. She nodded. Richard filled it from the bathroom sink, poured her a glass and helped her drink. She squeezed his hand when he was done. Her grip was weak, but the gratitude in it was not. He went back to his room and sat on the edge of his bed until morning, making plans. 2 days later, Richard ended his undercover stay. He called an emergency meeting with his senior staff and told them everything. What he'd seen, what Eleanor had been doing, what the night shift staff wasn't doing. The director of nursing was defensive at first. "We're following protocol. We're meeting all the regulatory requirements." "I don't care about requirements," Richard interrupted. "I care about whether our residents feel cared for. And the answer is no, they don't. Not at night, not when it matters most." He pulled out the notes he'd been keeping. The times Eleanor had brought juice to residents who were thirsty. The times she'd adjusted blankets for people who were cold. The times she'd sat with people who were scared and alone. Things that should have been done by paid staff but weren't. "An 80-year-old woman is spending her pension to do our job," Richard said. "And she's been doing it for 4 years. That's not a volunteer story. That's a failure story. Our failure." The meeting lasted 3 hours. Richard laid out what needed to change. More night staff. Better training focused on compassionate care, not just task completion. A new protocol for evening and overnight rounds that included actual conversations with residents, not just quick checks. A patient advocate position, someone whose entire job was to notice the things that fell through the cracks. And he fired 2 of the night shift aides, not the ones he'd overheard talking. They were just symptoms of a larger problem. But 2 others he'd observed over several nights who were consistently rough with residents, impatient, dismissive. They'd been getting away with it because no one was watching. Now, someone had. Then Richard went to find Eleanor. She was in the garden, sitting on a bench in the weak October sunlight. She looked surprised when he sat down next to her. "Robert?" she said. "My name's not Robert," Richard said quietly. "It's Richard. Richard Moss. I own this facility." Eleanor's face went pale. You were undercover?" "I was. Because I heard complaints and I needed to see for myself what was happening at night." "Are you going to kick me out?" "No, I'm going to offer you a job." Eleanor stared at him. "What?" "I want you to be our first patient advocate. It'll be an official position, with a salary." Your job will be to do exactly what you've been doing, except you won't have to do it alone anymore. And you won't have to pay for supplies out of your own pocket. You'll work with the staff to make sure no one is overlooked. You'll be the voice for residents who can't speak up for themselves. I'm 80 years old. I know. And you've been doing this work for 4 years without pay, without support, without recognition. If you can do it for 4 years on your own, imagine what you can do with resources behind you. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Why? Because you made a promise to your husband, and I'm making a promise to you. No one else is going to die here feeling alone, not on my watch, not anymore. Eleanor took a shaky breath. I'll do it, but I have one condition. Name it. I want to start a program, an adopted grandparent program, where residents who don't have family can be paired with volunteers who will visit them regularly, who will be there for them so they never have to go through what Henry went through. Richard felt his throat tighten. Done. Over the next 6 months, everything changed. Not easily, not perfectly. There were staff members who resisted. There were budget fights. There were moments when Richard wondered if he was trying to do too much too fast. But Eleanor was relentless. She trained the new patient advocates. She developed the protocols for evening care. She personally launched the adopted grandparent program, recruiting volunteers from the community and carefully matching them with residents who needed connection. The night shift staff began to change too. Some left, but others, once they understood what was expected, rose to the challenge. They started sitting with residents instead of just checking on them. They started asking questions. They started noticing. Marcus, the aide who'd barely made eye contact during Richard's first night, became one of the program's biggest advocates. I didn't realize, he told Richard months later. I thought I was doing a good job because I was completing my tasks, but I wasn't seeing people. Eleanor taught me how to see people. The complaints stopped, and new comments started coming in. Families saying their loved ones seemed happier, less anxious, more engaged. One daughter wrote a letter thanking the staff for sitting with her mother during a particularly difficult night. She told me someone held her hand, the letter said. She told me she wasn't alone. That's all I ever wanted for her. Richard framed that letter and put it in his office, right next to his grandfather's original photograph of the building. But the moment that mattered most happened on a Thursday night in March, almost 6 months after Richard's undercover stay. He was doing a late-night walk-through, something he did regularly now, when he passed room 31, Henry's old room. He paused at the door and looked inside. A man named George was lying in the bed, elderly, frail, clearly near the end. His daughter sat beside him, holding his hand. And on the other side of the bed, in a chair pulled close, was Eleanor. She was talking softly to George, telling him stories the same way she'd told stories to Dorothy. His daughter looked up and saw Richard. She mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Richard nodded and continued walking. He didn't need to stay. George wasn't alone. That was the point. That was the promise. Later that night, George passed away peacefully, with his daughter on one side and Eleanor on the other. He died knowing he was loved, knowing he mattered, knowing someone was there. Eleanor called Richard the next morning to tell him. Her voice was steady but sad. "I kept my promise," she said. "You did," Richard replied, "and you've kept it every single day. There's something you should know about this story. It doesn't have a miracle ending. Eleanor didn't fix everything. The system still had problems. Staff still got tired. Residents still died. That's the nature of places like Meadowbrook. People come there to finish their lives, and no amount of hand lotion or warm socks or adopted grandparents can change that fundamental truth. But what did change was how people finished their lives. They finished them knowing they were seen, knowing they mattered, knowing that their fear and loneliness and pain were noticed by someone who cared enough to do something about it. Eleanor worked as patient advocate for 3 more years before her own health began to fail. The adopted grandparent program she started is still running, with over 40 volunteers now. The night shift protocols she helped develop have been adopted by 2 other facilities in the area. And the small acts of care she modelled, the juice, the socks, the lotion, the stories, have become part of the culture at Meadowbrook. She moved into the residential wing last year, full circle, back to being a resident instead of staff. But she still makes rounds sometimes when she has the energy, checking on the people she's loved for so long. Richard visits her every week. They sit in the garden when the weather's good, working on jigsaw puzzles, not saying much. They don't need to. They both know what they built together. They both know what it cost and what it's worth. Last month, a family contacted Richard about placing their mother at Meadowbrook. During the tour, the daughter asked what made this facility different from others. Richard thought about all the things he could say: the staffing ratios, the training programs, the safety protocols. But instead, he told her about Eleanor, about the warm towels and the late-night visits, about an 80-year-old woman who spent 4 years of her pension making sure strangers didn't die alone, about how one person's grief transformed into a system of care that changed everything. "That's what makes us different," Richard said. "We remember that care isn't a checklist, it's a promise." The daughter enrolled her mother the next day. "Here's what I want you to understand. Here's why this story matters. Institutions fail people, not always through cruelty, usually through blindness, through the belief that following protocol is the same as providing care, through the assumption that if something isn't measured, it doesn't matter. But every system is made up of individual people making individual choices, and sometimes one person choosing to care, really care, can change everything. Not by fixing the system, but by showing the system what it's supposed to look like." Eleanor didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for funding. She didn't wait for someone else to solve the problem. She just started doing the work. And eventually, the institution caught up to her. That's the lesson. Not that you need to spend your pension on strangers, not that you need to work for free, but that small acts of care, repeated consistently, create a standard that others will eventually be forced to meet. So here's my question for you. What are you seeing that others are missing? What small act of care could you do that no one's asking you to do? Maybe it's checking on a neighbor. Maybe it's calling someone who lives alone. Maybe it's just noticing when someone needs something and actually providing it instead of assuming someone else will. Leave a comment and tell me, because I think there are thousands of Eleanors out there doing quiet work that no one sees, holding the world together in ways that never make headlines. And I think their stories deserve to be told.